This brings us to the final installment of our accounting YouTube clips, and I'd just like to talk about taxation for a few minutes and focus on a little bit of vocabulary that's relevant there. Basically, a state can levy taxes on three levels. It can levy taxes on a federal level, a state level, or a municipal level, and these are the English translation for Bundesebene, Landesebene und Gemeindeebene. And when we use the verb to levy taxes, to levy something, to levy taxes means Steuern einheben in German. So that's a very important verb to remember there. There's three main categories of taxes that are generally or traditionally distinguished between, and these are personal taxes, property taxes, and transaction taxes. In the case of personal taxes, the tax is levied because somebody is a particular person, either a natural person, in the case of you or me, or an artificial person in the case of a corporation or company. And so typical examples of personal taxes are the income tax, the corporate tax, or the gift and estate tax is the Schenkungs- und Erbschaftssteuer. The second category of tax is the category of the property taxes, and das sind die Vermögenssteuern. And one very classic example of a property tax is the land tax, which is die Grundsteuer. And the third category refers to the transaction taxes, or Verkehrssteuern, and the most common transaction tax in business life is the value added tax, the Umsatzsteuer, which we'll talk a little more about later on. Now, in most cases, taxes are assessed by the tax office. What this means is that a taxpayer, also ein Steuerzahler, a taxpayer, submits a tax declaration, eine Steuererklärung, and the tax office, das Finanzamt, carries out a so-called assessment process. Das Finanzamt führt die Veranlagung durch. So the tax office carries out an assessment process, and then finally, when it reaches a decision, it issues a tax notice. The tax notice is the Steuerbescheid, and based on the tax notice, the taxpayer knows how high the tax for a particular period in time or for a particular object or something of the sort was. This is the normal scenario. In some cases, though, the law requires taxpayers to calculate and transfer the taxes on their own, at least initially. And whenever this happens, when a taxpayer has to calculate and transfer the tax on his or her own originally, we speak of self-assessed taxes. And a typical example of a self-assessed tax is the preliminary VAT installment, also die Umsatzsteuervorauszahlung, as well as the communal tax, die Kommunalsteuer. Both of those have to be calculated by companies and transferred on their own before they are later assessed by the tax office at a later period in time. There's a third option, which typically benefits employees in company, and that's referred to as a withholding tax. So withholding tax in German is called a Quellensteuer or Abzugsteuer. And a withholding tax arises whenever one party has to withhold and transfer the taxes for another party. And this is typically done in Austrian companies. The employees don't transfer their own income tax contribution to the tax office. Instead, the companies calculate the income tax contribution of every individual employee and automatically transfer that amount to the tax office. So the employee only receives the net salary. Das ist das Nettogehalt. The employee only receives the net salary on his bank accounts. Now, the three most important company-based taxes that you'll probably deal with in the future are the income tax, also Einkommensteuer, the corporate tax, also Körperschaftssteuer, and the value-added tax. And I want to talk a little bit about them and then wrap up. When we calculate income tax in Austria, there's a formula that you probably know in German, and I'd like to give you an overview of it in English. First of all, we have to add up all the revenue that a natural person has earned in all of the 7 possible revenue classes. If you want to know the translations for these, they're in the script. Once we've added up all those revenues, we deduct any losses from other revenue classes or from previous years. Das sind die Verlustabzüge, the loss absorption. And then the natural person is entitled to deduct the special deductions, Sonderausgaben. These are special deduction possibilities that the parliament gives natural persons, usually as incentives to get them to invest in certain things. And then finally, a natural person can deduct the extraordinary burdens, außergewöhnliche oder außerordentliche Belastungen, which are payments that individuals have to make based on an ailment of some sort or some other necessity that most people don't have to pay. And once we've deducted the loss absorptions, the special deductions, and the extraordinary burdens from our revenues, we're left with the assessment basis. Das ist die Bemessungsgrundlage, and that is the basis from which the income tax is calculated. Now, when calculating these revenues, we're given 3 possibilities in Austria, depending on whether somebody is a farmer or a poet or a free professional or a company, etc. I won't go into detail on that, but basically the 3 different methods of calculating revenue are, first of all, through a company's financial accounting and a subsequent tax reconciliation calculation, also durch die handelsrechtliche Gewinnermittlung mit anschließender Mehr-Weniger-Rechnung. Tax reconciliation ist die Mehr-Weniger-Rechnung. That's the alternative that companies usually use. Smaller companies have the option of carrying out cash-based accounting. Das ist die Einnahmen-Ausgabenrechnung. And then there's a variety of people that work in agriculture or in other professions that are allowed to calculate their income by compounding average rates. Das sind die pauschalierten Durchschnittssätze. These can be applied in certain cases. However you calculate your income, the rest remains the same. You can absorb losses, you have your special deductions, your extraordinary burdens, and you arrive at your assessment basis. Now, in the case of corporate tax is only calculated via financial accounting and subsequent tax reconciliation. So corporations don't have these other 2 alternatives. And the other element of corporate tax that I thought might be interesting from a vocabulary perspective is that Austrian corporate tax is a so-called flat tax. There's one rate that exists regardless of what the income of a company is. That's 25%. And in contrast to that, the income tax in Austria is a progressive tax where the tax rate increases in proportion to the natural person's income. This brings us to the last slide and the last terminology I'd like to get into, the Austrian value-added tax, which is abbreviated as VAT and is often called a sales tax. This is, of course, the Umsatzsteuer, and it's levied on the domestic sale of goods and services. And in terms of vocabulary, most companies must pay VAT, but at the same time they are allowed to deduct input VAT. An input tax or input VAT is die Vorsteuer. And as I said before, companies are required to file preliminary VAT installment declarations at regular intervals. Die müssen Umsatzsteuervoranmeldungen durchführen. And that brings us to everything I want to cover, and we're just under 10 minutes, so I wish you a wonderful weekend. See you next week. Ciao.